I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as the wipers swept the icy rain from my windshield. Seattle winters had a way of seeping into your bones, and tonight, the chill seemed to mirror the knot of anticipation I carried in my chest. My name is Merida Caraway. I'm 63, and I've spent the better part of my life building a company from the ground up. Independence has always been my anchor. And yet as I drove toward Rachel's townhouse in Ballard, I felt an unfamiliar flutter of hope. Maybe this Christmas would be different. Maybe after years of quiet support, my family would finally see me, not just the check I write, or the meals I've secretly financed. The basket of gifts beside me contained small treasures for my grandchildren, Lucas and Emma, 8 and 10, whose laughter I had missed far too often while they lived in the cozy suburban apartment Rachel and her husband, Kyle, rented. I had packed a modest gift for Rachel as well, a silk scarf, a gesture of goodwill I hoped would soften the edges between us. As I parked on the wet curb, I reminded myself to breathe, to carry warmth into the house rather than fear. I stepped into the drizzle and adjusted my wool coat, feeling the familiar tension that accompanied every visit. Rachel had always been confident, perhaps overly so, and Kyle, though kind in his own way, often seemed to defer to her whims. Over the years, I had learned to anticipate the subtle dismissals, the sideways glances, the quiet comments that reminded me I was a guest in the life of my own son's family. Tonight, though, I allowed myself a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the holidays could bridge the distance. As I approached the front door, I saw Lucas peeking through the window, a grin splitting his face when he spotted me. Emma followed, her small hand pressed against the glass. The sight pulled a smile from my lips and eased the tightness in my chest, if only slightly. The door opened before I could knock, and Rachel's voice called out a crisp greeting, tinged with the efficiency I'd come to expect. Kyle appeared behind her, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres, the aroma of roasted vegetables and spiced wine curling into the hallway. I stepped inside, letting the warmth of the house envelop me, and placed the basket gently on the counter. The apartment smelled of pine and cinnamon, a careful preparation for the evening ahead. I ran a hand along the polished surface of the dining table, noting the effort Rachel had put into arranging candles and ornaments. For a moment, I imagined the night unfolding with laughter and gratitude, the years of distance softened by shared presence. Then I remembered the countless times my contributions had gone unnoticed, the silent work I had done so Rachel and Kyle could live comfortably without acknowledging it. I took a deep breath and squared my shoulders. Tonight, I would participate fully, offering help in the kitchen, engaging with the children, and keeping my hope alive. Even if only for a few hours, I would allow myself to believe in a Christmas that might finally feel like home. And as I hung my coat and stepped further into the living room, the tension of the evening settled around me, like the Seattle mist outside, a quiet reminder that the night's true test was only just beginning. The aroma of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air as I moved about the kitchen, carefully arranging silverware and polishing the countertops. Lucas and Emma trailed behind me, their laughter echoing against the walls, filling the space with a warmth that almost erased the chill from the Seattle night. I handed them aprons and showed them how to sprinkle a little cinnamon on the holiday cookies, smiling as they scrambled to keep up their little hands dusted with flour. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to forget the tension I had felt while walking up the steps, focusing instead on the simple joy of watching them create small, imperfect masterpieces. Rachel appeared at the kitchen doorway holding a tray of appetizers with practiced ease, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. She gave me a polite nod, though her eyes lingered on the counter I had just wiped down, as if questioning whether it met her standards. Kyle followed behind her, carrying a bottle of wine and a stack of plates, humming quietly under his breath. Their composure, the seamless choreography of their movements, reminded me that I was still an observer in a household that I had supported quietly for years, yet never truly belonged to. I moved to the dining room, adjusting the garland on the mantel and straightening the candles that Rachel had already lit. The Christmas lights twinkled softly, reflecting off the polished table and casting a gentle glow over the room. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect, perhaps. I caught Rachel's glance as she checked the seating arrangements, and I noticed a faint smirk that did not reach her eyes. Kyle placed the plates carefully, his smile polite but distant, leaving me to wonder if either of them truly appreciated the hours of preparation, the subtle guidance I had provided behind the scenes all these years. I glanced back toward the kitchen where the children were engaged in a playful flower fight and felt a pang of bittersweet satisfaction. At least the kids were happy, oblivious to the silent undercurrent swirling through the adults around them. I leaned down to help Emma lift a slightly lopsided cookie tray, feeling the warmth of her tiny hand in mine, and I allowed myself a brief smile. These small moments were mine, if nothing else. Rachel approached, offering instructions in her crisp, controlled voice. "Merida, could you make sure the napkins are folded evenly? We don't want any uneven corners tonight." I nodded and complied, careful to keep my tone neutral. The words were polite, almost courteous, but the subtle implication stung. I had done this 100 times before, yet my competence was still subject to evaluation. Kyle, meanwhile, moved between the kitchen and dining room with effortless charm, arranging things with a precision I had learned to anticipate but not always admire. I poured myself a cup of mulled cider and stepped back, observing the room. Everything shimmered and gleamed, a perfect holiday tableau, and yet beneath it lay a fragile tension. I was here to help, to nurture, to provide a sense of family for the children, and yet the quiet acknowledgments I had hoped for remained just out of reach. I caught Lucas sneaking a cookie from the counter and gave him a mock glare, which drew a giggle from Emma, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of the evening eased. Still, I could feel the undercurrents of entitlement, the small, cutting glances, and the subtle dismissals that reminded me that my place here was never fully secure. I adjusted the centerpiece one last time and stepped back, taking in the scene. The children's laughter, the glow of the lights, and the aroma of spiced wine and roasted vegetables filled the room with warmth. Yet a quiet unease pressed at the edges of my awareness. I moved toward the stove to check on the roasting vegetables, my hands steady, despite the flutter in my chest. Tonight was meant to be festive, meant to bridge years of distance, yet I could not shake the feeling that the real test, the one that mattered most, was yet to come. The dining room glowed under the soft twinkle of Christmas lights, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps this evening could be different. The table was set immaculately, plates, gleaming candles flickering, and the rich aroma of roasted vegetables and spiced wine filled the room. My grandchildren, Lucas and Emma, sat fidgeting in their chairs, eagerly anticipating the meal I had helped prepare. I glanced around, taking in the scene. Rachel slicing the roast with precision, Kyle pouring wine into glasses, their movements synchronized and effortless. I smiled faintly, feeling a small sense of pride in the life I had quietly supported for them all these years. Then it happened. Rachel looked at me, her expression sharp, her smile thin and calculated. "Merida," she said, her voice clear and deliberate. "You don't deserve the leftovers." The words hit me like a frozen gust of wind. I froze mid-step, my hands poised over my plate, a shallow breath caught somewhere between my chest and throat. The room seemed to fall into a heavy silence, though the clinking of silverware continued around me. Lucas and Emma looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes, their little faces confused as they held their forks mid-air. I could see the question in their expressions. Why was their grandmother being treated like an outsider in her own family? I swallowed, willing myself to maintain composure, but my heart hammered so fiercely, I feared it might betray me. Kyle, seated across from me, continued eating his fork, moving mechanically, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the table. It was the indifference that cut deepest the quiet complicity of my son-in-law, who should have recognized the cruelty of the moment. Rachel's hand rested deliberately on the edge of my plate, blocking me from serving myself, her eyes glinting with satisfaction as she asserted control. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, I could not process what I had just heard. I had spent decades building my life, not for accolades or public recognition, but to provide, protect, and support those I loved. Every Christmas, every birthday, every small need of this family had been met silently, almost invisibly. And yet here I stood humiliated in front of the very people whose comfort and happiness I had sustained without their knowledge. Rachel, I began, my voice steadier than I felt I helped prepare this meal. She turned slightly, not fully, meeting my eyes. Helping is not paying, Merida, she said coolly. I bought the roast, I arranged the table. I am the one who contributes here. You have no say tonight. Her words were precise, sharp-edged, each one striking with calculated cruelty. The grandchildren looked between us, their confusion mounting, sensing the tension that crackled in the air like static. Lucas fidgeted, whispering softly to Emma. Why isn't Grandma eating? Emma shrugged, biting her lip, unsure how to respond. I tried to meet Rachel's gaze to convey the depth of the love and sacrifices that had been entirely invisible to her, but she would not allow it. Kyle shifted in his chair, still silent, still complicit, his posture, a subtle reinforcement of Rachel's authority. I felt the room close in the warm glow of the lights, now turning oppressive, highlighting the injustice of my exclusion. Every instinct within me screamed to leave, to step away from the table and the humiliation. But I stayed. I remained still, my hands trembling slightly as I held my empty plate. The children's eyes, wide and questioning, kept me rooted. I wanted to shield them from this display of cruelty, yet I could not hide the sting of betrayal. The tension was unbearable, a taut wire that stretched across the table and hummed with unspoken accusations. I had been rendered powerless in a single sentence, publicly denied a seat at the very table I had helped build. The contrast between my quiet, unseen contributions and this moment of sharp public denial cut deeper than any criticism could have. I inhaled, holding the air in my lungs, feeling the simmering mix of shock, humiliation, and anger coalesce into a cold, steady determination. This would not pass unremarked, I told myself. Every act of disregard, every subtle dismissal, every unacknowledged effort had built toward a reckoning that Rachel and Kyle could not yet imagine. For now, I remained seated, outwardly calm, while the room continued around me. But inside, a fire had been lit, one that would not be extinguished, and the evening, seemingly festive, had transformed into the first act of a confrontation long overdue. As the clatter of plates and murmurs of conversation continued around the dining room, I retreated briefly to the kitchen, seeking the faintest refuge from the sting of Rachel's words. Standing by the counter, I closed my eyes and allowed my mind to drift memories of years gone by, surfacing in sharp relief. For over a decade, I had quietly supported this family in ways they would never know. Every check, every transfer, every silent sacrifice had been done out of love, without expectation of recognition or gratitude. It had begun shortly after Rachel and Kyle moved into that modest apartment in Ballard, a place they could barely afford on their own. The rent, almost $3,500 a month, had seemed insurmountable, and without hesitation I took it on, convincing myself that it was a small price to ensure their comfort. Kyle had always been earnest, diligent in his work, but the cost of living in Seattle was relentless. I sent the money directly to the landlord, allowing them to believe it was a kind offer from the property management. No mention of my contribution ever crossed their lips. When Rachel began her graduate program, I quietly covered her tuition books and living expenses. I had sat late into the night, balancing spreadsheets and transferring funds with care, ensuring that every cent was accounted for. She had celebrated her milestones with no idea that each step had been made possible by my hard work and foresight. And when they married, I provided discreet financial support for the wedding, for small renovations for household necessities, all while keeping my involvement invisible. My contributions became the silent framework upon which their lives were built. As I leaned against the counter, I remembered the nights I had stayed up late, reviewing their monthly expenses, calculating exactly how much to transfer without raising questions. I recalled the countless conversations with my bank, the careful management of my accounts, and the strategic planning that allowed me to sustain this hidden generosity. It had been exhausting, yes, but fulfilling in its quiet way. I had taken pride in knowing that my love had tangible effect, that my efforts ensured that Lucas and Emma would grow up without the financial insecurities I had faced in my own youth. Yet, here I stood, moments ago being denied even a seat at the table, blocked from serving myself a plate of the very meal I had helped prepare. The contrast was bitter. My decades of hard work and quiet support had amounted to nothing in the eyes of those I had helped most. Rachel's sharp words echoed in my mind, each syllable a reminder that my sacrifices were invisible, and perhaps had always been invisible to the people I cared for most. I thought of the gifts tucked away for Lucas and Emma, the carefully chosen toys and treats that had cost me more than I cared to calculate. I remembered placing the small scarf for Rachel into my bag, with the hope that even a token gesture could soften her stance, could elicit a spark of appreciation for the years I had spent making life easier for them. Instead, it had been met with cold dismissal, a pointed reminder that no amount of generosity could secure my place at this table or in this household. The weight of all those years of unseen effort and silent care settled heavily on my shoulders. I realized that love alone was not enough. It required recognition, respect, and acknowledgement to complete its cycle. And yet in this moment, I understood that my work had been entirely selfless, and that perhaps it had to remain so. The humiliation I had endured would not diminish the love I felt, nor the pride in knowing that regardless of Rachel's ignorance, I had given them a life cushioned against struggle. I straightened the quiet resolve in my chest, hardening into something firmer. Every transfer, every silent act of support had been deliberate, intentional, and meaningful. And now, faced with the stark reality of Rachel's cruelty, I recognized that it was time for the scales to balance, for the hidden contributions to take on a new significance, one that Rachel would not be able to ignore, whether she realized it yet or not. I stepped back from the counter, my hands lingering on the smooth edge as I surveyed the room. The dining table gleamed under the warm glow of the Christmas lights, and the children were happily absorbed in their cookies, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around them. Lucas and Emma chattered excitedly about Santa and the presents they would find in the morning, their joy piercing through the thick tension that had settled over the adults. I let myself smile faintly at their innocence, even as my eyes tracked every movement around the table. Rachel moved with practiced ease, arranging the silverware and adjusting the napkins as though she were conducting an orchestra. Every gesture was deliberate, every glance calculated to project a sense of control and authority. Kyle hovered nearby, pouring wine and smiling at her cues, subtly reinforcing the impression that she was the undisputed anchor of the household. The two of them seemed in perfect sync, a performance that demanded admiration from any guest watching. My stomach tightened as I realized the audience wasn't imaginary. Tonight, Rachel had invited her business associate, a man I had only met briefly, whose presence seemed to sharpen her need to demonstrate competence and poise. I watched him from the corner of my eye, noting how carefully Rachel guided him through the table, how she described each dish with a smile that appeared effortless but felt rehearsed. Kyle laughed at her jokes, a beat too late, his amusement carefully measured. My internal conflict churned. Part of me wanted to confront them, to call out the subtle cruelty and the theatrics designed to impress this outsider. But another part, the maternal part, urged patience, reminded me that acting impulsively could backfire and diminish the quiet control I still held over their lives in ways they could not yet perceive. As I moved closer to the kitchen counter, I observed the subtle exchanges between Kyle and Rachel, a tilt of his head, a smirk, a nod that barely registered, but spoke volumes. They were complicit, both in the public denial of me at the table and in the carefully curated show for their guest. The realization stung a cold pulse of anger, mixed with disbelief. All the years I had invested financially, emotionally, silently, were reduced in their eyes to irrelevance at this single gathering. I bent down to adjust the placement of a glass, my fingers brushing against the rim, and felt a surge of quiet determination. Anger simmered beneath the surface, tempered only by the decades of restraint that had shaped my character. I could not allow the indignity to go unremarked. Yet I also understood the necessity of timing. A wrong move, an impulsive reaction would spoil the leverage I held quietly and visibly over the structure of their lives. Every transfer, every support I had provided remained a hidden power they could not yet fathom. The children ran past their small feet, thudding against the hardwood, and I forced a gentle smile at them. Lucas whispered something to Emma, and I caught the tail end of it, a fleeting reminder of the stakes that extended beyond my own pride. My anger was real sharp, but it had to be measured. I would bide my time, and ensure that when the reckoning came, it would be deliberate, precise, and unforgettable. I straightened, inhaled the fragrant warmth of the kitchen, and allowed my gaze to linger one last time on the pair orchestrating the evening. The quiet observation had revealed far more than words could convey, and the seed of resolve had taken root. Every move they made tonight would be remembered, catalogued, and used in the course of the reckoning that I knew was coming. My heart thrummed with a mixture of fury and control, the perfect balance between restraint and anticipation, and I reminded myself that patience now would ensure that justice, when it came, would be undeniable. I slipped away from the bustling dining room, the laughter and clinking of cutlery fading behind me as I closed the door to the guest room. The sudden quiet was almost shocking, the contrast sharp against the warmth and chaos I had just left. I sank into the armchair by the window, the faint reflection of Seattle's rain-slicked streets casting a muted light across the room. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself to breathe, to let the hum of my racing thoughts settle into a slow, deliberate rhythm. Every instinct in me was clamoring for immediate confrontation, for a sharp retort that would puncture the carefully constructed facade Rachel had built around her authority. The memory of her voice, cold and cutting, replayed in my mind. "You don't deserve the leftovers." The sting of humiliation had barely subsided, and yet beneath it, a quiet clarity began to form. Anger surged, yes, but so did an understanding of the power I still held, the influence woven through years of quiet support and unseen contributions. I thought of every apartment payment, every tuition check, every monthly transfer that had sustained them all without acknowledgement. Each act had been deliberate, grounded in love, but now they stood as leverage, a silent strength they could not yet recognize. My moral compass shifted a delicate balance between justice and the love I still felt for my family. The desire for retribution warred with the instinct to preserve what bonds remained. Could I punish without causing irreparable damage? Could I teach a lesson that resonated deeply without crossing the line into cruelty? I rose from the chair and moved toward the desk in the corner, running a hand over the smooth surface where my notes and bills were neatly stacked. Each document, each account statement represented the careful scaffolding of support I had provided. The weight of these years of generosity pressed on me not as guilt, but as a responsibility to wield it wisely. I thought of the children, Lucas and Emma, their innocence untouched by the tension between the adults. Whatever actions I chose had to protect them from harm, even as I corrected the imbalance of power in this household. My mind began to map the possibilities, weighing precision against impulsivity. A sudden withdrawal of support could shock them into recognition, but it had to be controlled, systematic, leaving no doubt about the source of their comfortable lives. Yet I also wanted to leave room for reflection, for growth, for an awakening that extended beyond fear or anger. The idea of walking a tightrope between justice and love demanded focus, patience, and an almost surgical precision in planning. Every step I took had to maintain my integrity, while ensuring that the lesson landed with clarity and permanence. I sank back into the chair, closing my eyes and letting the quiet flood the room. I pictured the confrontation as it might unfold, imagined the shock and confusion in their faces, the gradual dawning of understanding, when they realized that their life of comfort had been sustained by unseen hands. And yet, I imagined the possibility of reconciliation afterward, a path where respect could be restored without erasing the memory of the lesson. This was not revenge for its own sake. It was correction, calibration, and the reassertion of boundaries long ignored. I opened my eyes and exhaled slowly, the plan solidifying in my mind. The evening's humiliation had sparked a fire, but it would be tempered by strategy, careful execution, and a steadfast commitment to fairness. I would act, yes, but not recklessly. Every transfer, every account, every legal leverage would be employed deliberately. In this quiet room, I felt the full weight of my power, tempered by love and responsibility, ready to transform the injustice of the night into a turning point that could not be ignored. I returned home that night, with the city lights of Seattle casting long reflections across the damp streets, a cold rain tapping softly against the windshield as if punctuating the storm brewing in my mind. Every moment of Rachel's cruelty, every calculated glance Kyle had exchanged with her, replayed relentlessly in my thoughts. The humiliation of being denied even a seat at the table, of having my contributions ignored and my presence dismissed, had ignited a quiet but unyielding resolve. It was time to act not with impulsive fury, but with precision, deliberation, and control. Once inside my apartment, I moved directly to the study where my legal and financial documents were arranged neatly in folders I had organized over the years. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the small Christmas tree I had set up in the corner, its lights twinkling softly, a stark contrast to the tension vibrating in my chest. I reached for the phone and dialed the number of my trusted attorney, Marcus Donovan. His voice came through calm and measured, as always. "Marcus, it's Marita. I need to implement a series of changes immediately," I said, keeping my tone composed. "It concerns my accounts, my guarantees, and certain rental obligations for Rachel and Kyle." I enumerated the details carefully, each word deliberate. Over the years, Marcus had guided me through complex financial structures, and I trusted him implicitly to act quickly without alerting the family prematurely. I instructed him to cancel the automatic transfers I had been sending monthly, over $2,000 in total, to cover living expenses, tuition, and incidental costs for Rachel and her household. Each transfer had been a silent lifeline, a scaffold upon which their comfortable life had been built. The thought that the comfort they had taken for granted would suddenly vanish sent a quiet thrill through me, tempered by the awareness of the responsibility I carried. This was not malice. This was a necessary correction, a realignment of boundaries and recognition that respect must accompany privilege. Next, I directed Marcus to revoke any guarantees I had placed on their accounts, including Rachel's credit card and emergency overdraft privileges. I wanted every safety net I had, quietly provided, removed, so that when the reality of their dependence came into sharp focus, they would have no doubt of its source. Marcus listened intently, taking notes and confirming each action. "Are you certain, Merida? These are significant changes," he asked. I nodded, feeling the weight of years of silent support compress into this single decisive moment. Finally, I turned my attention to the apartment in Ballard. For nearly 8 years, I had covered the rent directly, allowing Rachel and Kyle to believe the landlord was offering a special arrangement. Now it was time for that illusion to end. I instructed Marcus to notify the landlord that I was withdrawing from the arrangement and would no longer cover the payments. Legal notice would be delivered, giving them the required 30 days to adjust, but no extensions, no exceptions. With each instruction I issued, I felt a strange mix of empowerment and gravity. These were my actions, deliberate and contained, yet the ripple effects would extend far beyond my immediate control. I imagined Rachel discovering the first blocked transfer, Kyle realizing the guarantees had vanished, and the subtle panic that would spread through their carefully curated life. And yet the children, Lucas and Emma, would remain untouched, their joy separate from the necessary consequence being enacted on their parents. I ended the call with Marcus and leaned back, exhaling slowly. The plan was set into motion, each step measured and legally sound. Every detail had been anticipated, from banking delays to landlord procedures. I could feel the quiet hum of tension building in my chest, a mixture of satisfaction, resolve, and an awareness of the potential escalation. This was the beginning of a reckoning, the first wave of consequences for years of disregard and arrogance. As I gazed out at the rain-soaked streets below, the twinkling lights of the city, reflecting in puddles like fractured stars, I allowed myself a brief smile. The night's humiliation had sparked this fire, but now it burned with purpose, tempered by strategy, and directed by the quiet, unyielding knowledge that justice, when wielded carefully, could not be ignored. The morning light in Seattle filtered weakly through the blinds, casting a muted glow across the apartment in Ballard. Rachel stirred, first yawning and stretching her mind, still groggy from sleep. She reached for her phone, intending to check her messages, and froze. The balance on her checking account had changed dramatically. Numbers she had taken for granted for years no longer matched expectations. Confusion rippled across her face, quickly followed by a creeping sense of panic. Kyle, still in his pajamas, came into the kitchen, carrying a mug of coffee, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Rachel's expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, trying to mask the worry in his own voice. Rachel handed him the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. Kyle scrolled through the transactions and transfers, his brow furrowing as the realization sank in. The monthly deposits they had relied upon, quiet, invisible, uninterrupted for years, had stopped. "What the hell?" Kyle muttered under his breath. "These transfers, they're gone. Did the bank make a mistake?" Rachel shook her head, panic escalating. "No, it's someone. This isn't possible." Her voice pitched higher, a mixture of disbelief and dread. She rifled through the recent notifications, reading each one aloud. Every line reinforced the impossible truth. The financial safety net they had assumed was permanent had vanished overnight. The checks Merida had sent quietly, the hidden payments, the guarantees, all revoked. Kyle leaned against the counter, running a hand through his hair. We relied on this for everything he said. Voice tight. Rent bills. The kids' school groceries. His eyes met Rachel's, and in that instant, both understood the enormity of what had occurred. The illusion of independence they had flaunted was gone, and with it, the stability they had always counted on. Rachel moved to the apartment lease folder, her fingers trembling as she located the notice of withdrawal. Her eyes scanned the document, and she swallowed hard, realizing that even the rent she had believed secure was no longer guaranteed. The 30-day notice left them little room to maneuver, and any hope of negotiating quietly vanished in the face of Merida's deliberate, calculated action. Tension filled the air like a thick fog. Rachel paced the small living room, muttering fragments of disbelief, while Kyle pulled the children close, whispering reassurances he himself did not believe. "We'll figure this out," he murmured, though the tight line of his jaw betrayed the fear simmering beneath his words. Lucas and Emma looked on with confusion, sensing their parents' distress, but not comprehending the source. Rachel's phone rang incessantly. It was the bank confirming the cancellations, the legal notices, and the revoked guarantees. Each call, each automated message drove home the sudden fragility of the life they had relied upon for so long. Her breathing grew rapid, shallow, a stark contrast to the carefully composed demeanor she had displayed the night before. Kyle sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor, running through their options mentally, and finding none that offered immediate relief. The realization that their financial independence had been a carefully maintained illusion, dependent entirely on Merida's silent generosity, struck with a force that left both of them reeling. Rachel's hands shook as she tried to call Merida, but the calls went unanswered. The power she had assumed over her own household had evaporated. Every small certainty of the life she had built crumbled, leaving behind confusion, fear, and a dawning understanding of the consequences of taking another's generosity for granted. Outside, the drizzle continued to fall, tapping against the windows like a reminder that the world did not wait for anyone's comfort. Inside, panic simmered, and the carefully constructed equilibrium of their lives fractured, leaving Rachel and Kyle to confront, for the first time, the reality they had ignored, dismissed, and presumed unbreakable for years. By the second morning, the full weight of Merida's decisions began to ripple through Rachel and Kyle's lives. The eviction notice, carefully timed and legally precise, sat on the kitchen counter like a physical manifestation of the truth they had long avoided. Rachel held it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning each line over and over, as though sheer repetition could undo what had been set in motion. The comfortable certainty of their lives, the apartment, the uninterrupted flow of funds, the invisible hand of support, had vanished overnight. Kyle slumped into the nearest chair, running a hand across his face. The children, Lucas and Emma, played quietly with their breakfast, sensing the tension without understanding it fully. Rachel's voice, once brisk and commanding, now faltered as she read aloud the bank notifications detailing canceled transfers and revoked guarantees. Every number, every formal line underscored the fact that the financial scaffolding they had relied on for years was gone. "Merida, she can't really do this," Rachel whispered more to herself than to Kyle. Her panic was edged with a fragile hope that somehow the bank had erred, that some oversight would restore their life to its familiar rhythm. But with each call confirming the cancellations, each automated notice clarifying the revocation of privileges, that hope ebbed away, replaced by the stark, inescapable reality. Kyle picked up his phone and scrolled through account statements. His brow furrowed. Everything she provided, gone. Our emergency fund, the transfers, even the guarantees, he muttered. He glanced at Rachel, her lips pressed in a tight line, the shock mirrored in her wide eyes. The illusion of control they had projected for so long crumbled before them, leaving only confusion and fear. The children's questions came quietly at first. Lucas tugged at Kyle's sleeve. "Mommy, why can't Grandma eat with us?" Emma added softly, her small voice tinged with worry. Rachel's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth ready to deflect to explain, but found no words that could protect them from the sudden upheaval. The life she had presented as stable and self-sufficient had depended entirely on the quiet, invisible support of the very person she had humiliated only nights before. Outside, the winter rain continued to fall, a constant reminder that the world moved forward regardless of individual comfort. Inside, Rachel paced the small apartment, trying to calculate their next move, while Kyle sat slumped, flipping through bills and notices, each one a nail in the coffin of their long-assumed independence. The landlord's final notice made it clear that the 30 days to vacate the apartment were non-negotiable. The luxury and security they had taken for granted were evaporating with terrifying speed. Merida, across town, watched the unfolding consequences with a mixture of satisfaction and calm detachment. She observed, not out of cruelty, but with the clarity of someone who had spent years quietly carrying the burdens of a family that had never recognized her sacrifices. Each panic-filled call Rachel made to the bank, each frantic consultation with friends or colleagues, unfolded exactly as Merida had anticipated. The shock, confusion, and urgency were entirely contained within the sphere of accountability she had orchestrated. In the apartment, Rachel tried calling Merida directly, but there was no answer. The stark realization of their dependence hit with full force. The security and comfort they had enjoyed had never truly been theirs. Every expense she had presumed was covered by their own resources had been silently provided, meticulously managed, and now withdrawn. The weight of unearned privilege, once invisible, now pressed heavily against Rachel's chest. Kyle rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath about overdue bills and the need to find a temporary solution for housing. The apartment, once a safe harbor, felt suddenly precarious. The realization that they would have to adjust to life without Merida's silent support, the life they had always assumed would be theirs, automatically dawned in slow, sharp increments. Merida sat in her quiet living room, the rain tapping against the windows, watching the inevitable consequences take shape. Justice, measured and precise, was unfolding exactly as she had intended. And while she felt a twinge of sorrow for the upheaval her actions caused, she also recognized the necessity. The family had been forced to confront a reality they had long ignored, and the lesson, though harsh, was finally being learned. By mid-morning, Rachel sat slumped on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring blankly at the wall. The chaos of the past 48 hours, the sudden financial restrictions, the eviction notices, the vanished transfers finally settled into a quiet, unyielding weight. Kyle hovered nearby, the lines of exhaustion etched across his face, deepening with each passing moment. For the first time, Rachel saw the full scope of the life she had taken for granted, the invisible support she had dismissed, and the stark consequences of her complacency. Her thoughts turned inward, tracing back through the years when independence had been more illusion than reality. She recalled college tuition, the wedding costs, the countless bills and emergencies that had been covered without question. Each moment she had flaunted autonomy, she had been shielded from reality by Merida's careful generosity. The revelation struck her like a physical blow. The freedom and comfort she had so casually enjoyed had been meticulously crafted by her mother-in-law's unseen hands. Rachel's mind replayed the dismissive tone she had used during the holiday dinner, the sharpness of her words, the calculated dismissal that had excluded Merida from the table entirely. She winced at the memory, the shame bubbling up like a bitter taste. It had never occurred to her how entitled her behavior had appeared, or how deeply it had undermined the woman who had quietly carried the burdens of their household. The scale of her oversight now loomed large, and for the first time she felt the disquieting twinge of true accountability. Kyle watched silently, recognizing the change in Rachel's demeanor. He had long assumed their household stability was the natural result of their planning and effort. But now he too confronted the uncomfortable truth. Their life had rested on foundations they had never acknowledged. As he offered her a quiet nod, Rachel took in his expression, seeing both concern and the dawning awareness of the same harsh reality. For the first time, Rachel began to imagine the daily life without Merida's silent support. The mortgage payments, the tuition transfers, the emergency safety nets, all gone. It was a world she had never needed to navigate before, and the fear it evoked was sobering. The habitual ease she had relied upon now felt fragile, and the luxury of her past complacency lay exposed as a privilege purchased and maintained by someone else's labor. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of regret settle alongside the realization of her own responsibility. Years of entitled independence, unexamined reliance, and unspoken assumptions now collided with the necessity of genuine reflection. Rachel began to recognize the arrogance in her behavior, the subtle but persistent belief that comfort and security were hers by default. As the morning light shifted across the room, illuminating dust motes in the air, a faint sense of clarity emerged from Rachel's introspection. She saw, perhaps for the first time, the depth of Merida's sacrifices, the quiet generosity that had shaped their lives, and the consequences of having taken it for granted. The seed of change, fragile but unmistakable, had been planted in the fertile soil of necessity. Rachel opened her eyes, her chest tight but steadying. She understood now that transformation would require more than remorse. It would require effort, humility, and a willingness to rebuild from the ground up. The awakening had begun, and with it the first glimmers of insight into the life she had squandered and the accountability she had yet to claim. The following morning, Rachel sat at the small kitchen table laptop, open a notepad beside her filled with scribbled notes and tentative ideas. The quiet of the apartment felt foreign, now stripped of the invisible support she had long depended on. For the first time in years, she faced the reality that bills would not be paid automatically, that the rent would need to come from her own earnings, and that the safety net she had always assumed was unshakable had been deliberately removed. She inhaled deeply and forced herself to focus. Her first step was to search for work, something tangible that would restore a sense of agency. She scanned job boards, her fingers hovering over listings. She had never imagined herself pursuing office assistant positions, retail shifts, part-time customer service roles. The pay was modest, the work unfamiliar, and yet each click reinforced the urgency of her situation. Rachel realized that independence came not from the illusion of financial stability, but from tangible effort resilience and the willingness to navigate uncertainty. She made her first call to a local staffing agency, her voice tentative but determined. The receptionist's clipped professional tone was the first small hurdle. "Do you have experience?" the woman asked. Rachel hesitated, fumbling with her words. Her resume, filled with years of household management and volunteer work, suddenly felt inadequate. The interview was brief, polite, and inconclusive, leaving Rachel with a sense of frustration that was entirely new to her. After hanging up, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the pale light filtering through the blinds. It was uncomfortable, humbling, but necessary. She jotted down a list of alternative opportunities: cleaning services, administrative support, even part-time receptionist roles at local clinics. Each entry represented a step away from dependence and toward responsibility, a tangible move to reclaim control over her life. Kyle entered quietly, carrying a mug of coffee, and observed her for a moment. He had been silently supportive, but the reality of their circumstances pressed on him too. "Are you okay?" he asked cautiously, sensing the mixture of determination and anxiety on her face. Rachel nodded, grateful for his presence, but aware that this was her journey alone. No one could do this for her, and no shortcuts could restore the independence she had ignored for so long. The day passed in a flurry of calls, emails, and forms. Rachel encountered rejection after rejection, positions already filled responses, delayed requirements she didn't meet. The setbacks were sobering, a clear contrast to the ease she had previously known. Yet each failure carried a lesson, teaching her patience, persistence, and the necessity of starting from the bottom to rebuild her confidence and competence. By evening, Rachel closed her laptop and stretched her muscles stiff from the day's effort. Her heart still ached with uncertainty, and the stress of confronting real-world responsibility pressed heavily on her. But there was a faint spark of satisfaction as well. She had taken the first step, tangible and deliberate, into a world where she could not rely on invisible generosity. Rachel realized that independence was not an abstract concept or a temporary state. It was a daily practice grounded in effort, humility, and persistence. She would face challenges, mistakes, and setbacks along the way, but each small accomplishment would reinforce her growing sense of agency. For the first time in her life, she understood that rebuilding meant more than surviving. It meant proving to herself that she could stand on her own. By mid-morning, Rachel had returned to her modest apartment in Vallejo, scanning the room with a mix of determination and apprehension. The small space, humble and sparsely furnished, served as a stark reminder of the independence she now had to embrace. Bills sat stacked on the counter, her laptop open to a list of potential jobs, and the weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders in a way she had never experienced before. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly. It was Merida. Rachel hesitated for a moment, the memory of Christmas Eve still fresh and raw. She answered, her voice polite but cautious. "Rachel, it's time we talk." Merida said, her tone firm yet calm. "I'm not here to fix your problems, but I will provide guidance, advice, structure, and insight, but no financial assistance. You need to learn to navigate this on your own." Rachel's heart skipped. The absence of monetary aid stung more than she expected, but the clarity in Merida's voice was grounding. For the first time, she realized that real support did not always come in the form of money. It could also come in direction, mentorship, and honest feedback. "I understand," Rachel replied, a hint of determination threading through her voice. Merida began by walking her through the basics, budgeting for rent, groceries, utilities, and unforeseen expenses. She guided Rachel in creating a realistic weekly schedule, balancing job applications, household responsibilities, and time with the children. Each piece of advice was practical and precise, designed to foster accountability rather than dependency. "You can do this, Rachel, but only if you take ownership. I can point the way, but the steps are yours to take," Merida emphasized. Rachel followed every suggestion, meticulously organizing her finances and prioritizing urgent obligations. She began making calls to employers, updating her resume, and drafting cover letters for positions she had previously dismissed as beneath her. Every rejection stung, yet each one became a learning moment, a chance to refine her approach, her tone, and her expectations. Merida remained a voice on the line, offering perspective when frustration threatened to overwhelm her, yet never offering solutions she could not implement herself. Over the next few days, Rachel tackled responsibilities she had long avoided. She navigated the landlord's office scheduling meetings to discuss lease agreements and dealt directly with utility companies regarding overdue payments. Kyle assisted sparingly, observing quietly from the sidelines, allowing Rachel to make decisions independently, a silent witness to her growing competence. Merida's mentorship extended beyond financial guidance. She coached Rachel in problem-solving strategies, emphasizing reflection and consequence evaluation. Every choice carries weight, Rachel, she reminded her. Consider the long-term effect before acting. Responsibility is measured not by ease but by thoughtfulness and consistency. Rachel internalized these lessons, feeling a new sense of control and clarity as she addressed each challenge systematically. The children, Lucas and Emma, noticed the change too. They observed their mother managing tasks with a newfound confidence, her frustration tempered by careful planning, her determination evident in her focused energy. Rachel realized that her actions were not only shaping her own life, but also modeling accountability for the children, a responsibility she could no longer take lightly. By evening, Rachel paused and reflected on the day. She had confronted setbacks, made decisions, and taken ownership without relying on the crutch of financial assistance. The process was exhausting and humbling, yet deeply rewarding. She felt a subtle but unmistakable shift within herself, a growing independence reinforced not by handouts, but by the disciplined application of guidance, perseverance, and deliberate action. Merida's tough love had created a framework for transformation. Rachel understood that support was not synonymous with enabling. It was mentorship, patience, and expectation that required personal effort and resilience. She could feel the first stirrings of real, sustainable change, and for the first time, she grasped the depth of growth that came from navigating responsibility entirely on her own. Rachel's alarm buzzed sharply, dragging her from a restless sleep. She groaned and swung her legs off the bed, staring at the stack of bills on the small nightstand. Despite weeks of planning and careful budgeting, the reality of independence was pressing in with an unrelenting weight. Each payment, each expense required conscious calculation, leaving no room for error. The safety she had once assumed existed had been stripped away, entirely replaced with a daily test of resourcefulness and endurance. Her first task of the morning was a call to a potential employer. She had spent hours tailoring her resume, writing cover letters, and practicing for interviews, but the response was brief and discouraging. The position had been filled. Rachel's stomach sank, a mix of frustration and self-doubt coursing through her. She knew this was only the beginning, that setbacks were inevitable, but the sting of rejection still hit with surprising force. Kyle stirred in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, glancing at her over the rim. "Another one?" he asked quietly. His tone carried sympathy. Yet there was an edge of tension. He was witnessing the unraveling of the comfort he had long taken for granted. Rachel nodded, muttering something about trying again, and returned to her laptop, forcing focus while the sense of mounting pressure pressed at her chest. By mid-morning, the financial strain became tangible. A utility bill had been miscalculated, leaving a past due notice in the mailbox. Rachel tried to adjust the payment, but the online system rejected her attempt. Panic crept in, a creeping reminder that mistakes now carried immediate consequences. Kyle offered assistance, but his hesitance mirrored the shifting dynamics in their relationship. The equilibrium they had relied on for years was gone, and neither of them could fully navigate it alone. As the children played quietly in the corner, Rachel attempted to reconcile these failures with the lessons Merida had imparted. She had learned to plan, to prioritize, and to make decisions independently, yet experience proved that intention alone was not enough. Every misstep, every rejection, Every overlooked bill felt magnified under the new lens of responsibility. It was a harsh but necessary confrontation with the limits of her previous knowledge and capability. Tensions flared subtly with Kyle over minor disagreements. Decisions that had once been routine now became points of contention: how to allocate funds, what priorities to set, which job applications to pursue first. Each discussion carried an undercurrent of stress, revealing the fragility of the partnership they had assumed was resilient. Rachel realized that independence was not merely personal. It affected every interaction and relationship tied to her decisions. By evening, Rachel slumped at the kitchen table, exhausted but resolute. She had confronted failure in both work and finances, had navigated arguments with Kyle, and had faced the mounting reality of fully accountable life. Each misstep was a lesson, each setback a challenge to adapt, to think critically, and to persevere. For the first time, Rachel recognized the depth of transformation required, not simply in acquiring skills or income, but in reshaping her mindset, her patience, and her resilience. Genuine independence demanded that she absorb the consequences of her actions, learn from errors, and persist in the face of uncertainty. The process was uncomfortable, humbling, and essential, forcing her to confront parts of herself she had long avoided. In the quiet of the apartment, Rachel allowed herself a moment to breathe. She understood now that growth would not be linear, that each challenge tested her character and resolve. The hard lessons were proving indispensable, forging a foundation for the independent life she had once dismissed as difficult, yet was now beginning to claim for herself. The morning sunlight spilled into the small Vallejo apartment, illuminating the organized chaos of Rachel's workspace. Papers were stacked neatly, bills sorted by priority, and her laptop displayed a list of interviews she had scheduled for the week. For the first time in months, she felt a quiet sense of control, the chaotic weight of her previous reliance slowly being replaced by tangible structure. Each small success reinforced the lessons Merida had instilled, her tough love, now proving its value through visible results. Rachel started the day by calling back a local cleaning service that had expressed interest in hiring her. She spoke confidently, clearly outlining her availability and willingness to take on night and weekend shifts. The voice on the other end responded positively, setting up an in-person interview for the next day. Rachel hung up her chest, lightened with the small but meaningful accomplishment. Each step, no matter how minor, began to chip away at the overwhelming anxiety that had plagued her since the financial upheaval. Kyle observed her progress silently from the kitchen doorway, his coffee mug in hand. He had grown accustomed to her newfound independence and was cautiously impressed by her determination. He offered guidance sparingly, allowing her to navigate the details herself, a marked shift from their previous dynamic, where he had assumed much of the responsibility. Rachel appreciated his presence, but understood that she now had to prove to herself, not just him, that she could manage her life responsibly. Throughout the morning, Rachel managed multiple tasks with deliberate care. She logged into her bank account to track overdue bills, adjusted her spending for the week, and contacted utility providers to arrange partial payments where necessary. Every action reinforced the sense that she was capable of navigating the world without relying on hidden support. The process was exhausting, but the tangible results, an interview, scheduled bills in order, and a plan for the next week brought a deep sense of validation. Even the children contributed in small ways, offering smiles and gentle questions that reminded her of why she was pushing herself so hard. Lucas asked about the groceries she had purchased, and Rachel explained her budgeting decisions in simple terms, letting him understand the responsibility that came with managing resources. Emma helped tidy up the living room after breakfast, and Rachel's guidance encouraged both children to participate actively, teaching them the value of accountability and effort. By afternoon, Rachel had begun to feel a growing sense of pride. The morning's small victories combined with careful planning demonstrated to her that she could maintain consistency. She reflected on how far she had come since the first days of sudden independence. The panic, the mistakes, the arguments with Kyle, and the frustration of learning tasks she had long taken for granted. The difference now was that each challenge was met with thoughtful action, not reactive panic. She paused to check her schedule for the week, noting several follow-up calls to potential employers, errands to manage household obligations, and time blocked for preparing meals efficiently. The structure itself was empowering a visible representation of her growing capability. For the first time, she understood that Merida's tough approach, removing financial support while providing guidance, was not cruelty, but a methodical push toward genuine self-reliance. Even Kyle recognized the shift occasionally, nodding with approval as he observed her methodical handling of tasks. The quiet, consistent diligence she displayed offered the first tangible signs that trust once untested could be rebuilt through demonstrated responsibility. Rachel understood that the path ahead was still long, that setbacks would occur, but each deliberate, consistent action now carried a weight of meaning that had been absent in her previous dependent life. As the evening approached and the apartment settled into a calm rhythm, Rachel allowed herself a moment to reflect. The small victories of the day were proof that transformation was possible, that independence could be cultivated with persistence and accountability. Merida's tough love had laid the foundation, and Rachel was finally walking steadily upon it, earning each success through effort, patience, and deliberate action. The first visit from Merida to Rachel's small Vallejo apartment was quiet, almost tentative. The air between them was charged with unspoken words, years of misunderstandings, and the tension of recent upheavals. Rachel opened the door, and for a moment, neither spoke, exchanging measured glances. Merida's expression was calm but firm, signaling both authority and willingness to bridge the gap. "Thank you for letting me in," Merida said softly, stepping past the threshold with care. Rachel gestured toward the modest living room, and Merida took a seat on the edge of the couch. She observed the space, the carefully arranged furniture, the small touches of personal effort Rachel had added, and the subtle signs of a life beginning to stabilize under her own effort. Rachel sat opposite her mother-in-law, hands folded in her lap, hesitant yet determined. I wanted to show you I'm trying," she admitted, her voice low but steady. "I know I relied on you too much, and I didn't understand what you were doing for us all these years." The words were halting, sincere, and carried the weight of newfound awareness. Merida listened without interruption, letting the statement settle between them. "I can see that," Rachel Merida said, finally, her tone measured. "Acknowledging it is the first step, but understanding must be paired with action, with consistent responsibility. That is what will rebuild trust slowly and deliberately." She leaned back slightly, allowing the gravity of her guidance to emphasize its importance without intimidation. The conversation unfolded cautiously, with Merida guiding Rachel through reflection rather than reprimand. They spoke of responsibilities, financial management, and the importance of planning each discussion grounded in practicality and respect. Merida made it clear that support had its boundaries, now that the era of silent financial backing had ended. Rachel accepted this, firmly understanding that boundaries were essential to preserving respect on both sides. As the hours passed, the tension began to ease. They shared small stories about the children, anecdotes of Lucas and Emma that elicited laughter and a shared warmth that had been absent for too long. The tone shifted subtly from confrontation to collaboration, a mutual recognition that while the past could not be undone, a new dynamic could emerge. Merida also acknowledged Rachel's efforts, pointing out the diligence she had demonstrated in recent weeks budgeting job searches and independent problem-solving. "I see your progress," Merida said, a small smile touching her lips. "It's not perfect, but it's consistent, and that is what matters." Consistency builds reliability, and reliability fosters respect. Rachel absorbed the words, feeling a mix of pride and humility. They paused together, the room filled with a quiet understanding. Forgiveness was not immediate nor complete, but a foundation of respect had begun to take shape. Rachel recognized that Merida's tough love had not been cruelty, but a mechanism to instill agency and accountability. Merida recognized Rachel's sincerity and her commitment to change, allowing a cautious, tempered connection to grow. By the time Merida left, there was a sense of equilibrium in the room, fragile but tangible. Boundaries were defined, expectations clear, and mutual respect established. The visit marked a turning point. Love tempered by accountability could coexist with lessons learned and the scars of past betrayal. Both women had begun to navigate a new relationship, one built on understanding effort and the recognition that reconciliation did not require erasing the past, but honoring the growth it had catalyzed. 1 year had passed since the Christmas Eve that changed everything. The small apartment in Vallejo had become a home in the truest sense, a space Rachel managed independently, balancing Bill's schedules and the rhythm of daily life with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. She had learned to navigate setbacks without panic, to prioritize responsibilities, and to take ownership of her decisions. The lessons of the past year had transformed her, each challenge reinforcing resilience, accountability, and self-reliance. Lucas and Emma thrived in this new environment, their routines stable, their safety assured. Rachel had structured their lives to include both guidance and freedom, teaching them responsibility while protecting their childhood. They flourished academically and emotionally aware of the hard-earned balance their mother had cultivated. Their laughter filled the apartment, a tangible marker of stability and normalcy that Rachel had fought so hard to preserve. Merida, meanwhile, had reclaimed her own sense of autonomy and dignity. No longer the silent financier behind the scenes, she walked through her days free from the burden of enabling others. The quiet power she wielded before had been transformed into something deeper. A measured presence, a guiding hand from a distance, and the reassurance that her sacrifices had produced lasting growth. She and Rachel communicated regularly, their conversations grounded in mutual respect rather than dependence, and their boundaries clearly defined. Rachel had also secured steady employment, a position that challenged her, while respecting her schedule and responsibilities as a mother. She had learned to value her own work, to budget carefully, and to navigate the practicalities of independent living. Each paycheck, each small success, reinforced her sense of capability and reinforced the lessons Merida had insisted upon. Independence required effort, consistency, and thoughtful decision-making. The two women occasionally met for coffee, their exchanges a mix of reflection, mentorship, and candid conversation. The tension of past betrayal lingered faintly, but had been replaced largely by mutual understanding. They had learned that trust once broken required deliberate action and accountability to rebuild, and both had embraced the effort with patience and humility. As Rachel tucked Lucas and Emma into bed one evening, she paused to reflect on the past year, the hardships, the lessons, and the gradual transformation of herself, her children, and her relationship with Merida. The family, once fractured by entitlement and misunderstanding, had reached a new equilibrium, not perfect, but stable, earned through resilience and honesty. Merida, observing from a distance, felt a quiet satisfaction. The choices she had made, difficult, deliberate, and uncompromising, had not only restored respect for herself, but had guided Rachel toward genuine independence. They had forged a new kind of family, one defined not by assumption or unexamined privilege, but by accountability, growth, and the deliberate rebuilding of trust.